So thanks for the kind words. I've grown up as an economist hearing and reading what you had to say about many issues, so it's really a privilege and an honor to be here. And thanks very much to all of you to be here for being here. I've been asked to just spend 1 minute telling you about the INET Euro Council project. Basically, the idea by the INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, was to put together a group of economists from the entire Euro area. And when I say entire Euro area, this is trickier than it seems, because you in the United States, you have the blue-red division. We have the Rhine, and the Rhine has been there for too long. And it's, we seem to be going back to the Rhine. We have the economists from the north of the Rhine, the North Euro, who basically have a very, very different view. They are economists, they're trained in similar things, and they should have the same frameworks as the economists on the south of the Rhine. And yet, essentially, whenever you see any opinion or any comment on the Euro crisis, like you're hearing a different discipline talking. And I think, moved by this frustration and by this desire to kind of try to establish, to build bridges, this Institute for New Economic Thinking has asked a few of us to kind of try to dialogue and to kind of come to common positions. The document that you have, I think the virtue of the document is the fact that it has this, that it reflects this common position. It's signed by, for example, to talk about the north of the Rhine bit, by three members of the German Weizmann Council of the economic advisors to the Chancellor. Just the fact that you are going to have kind of several economists from both sides get to an agreement on what needs to be done, I think is very valuable, particularly now that the situation seems, sometimes you just think it's all too hopeless and too difficult to continue. So among the people who are in the team, Kevin O'Rourke from Ireland, Beatrice Verde-Muro from Germany and the Council, and Feld and Boffinger are also from the Council. Dennis Noer, Gross, also, well, kind of very, very involved, as you know, on all these things. Willem Bouter, a lot of Sapir, De Grauwe, Zettelmeier. Among the advisors, Stiglitz, Bosen, indeed, the future president of the institution. So a very eclectic group, and especially a group that tries to span both sides. What I'm going to do in the talk today, in the short time that I have, is I'm going to try to give you an overview of the situation in Spain as a case study of what's going wrong, and trying to give you as accurate as possible diagnosis of where we are. I am aware that Spain is kind of the center of the universe right now, and that suddenly people who've never heard or cared about whether Catalonia is or not entitled to independence now to have an opinion on whether that can happen, etc. So I'm going to try to help you to see what's going on. I will actually not talk much about Catalonia, but I will give you an overview of what's going on as a basic prelude to explain what the Eurozone problems are. That's my plan. I want to start by this slide, which reflects the current account up to last month of Spain. I'm calling it Fear itself. This is the rolling four-quarter totals. If you look at the green and the blue line, you see the mirror image that all of us are taught in school, that it's a current account, that it's the current account and the capital account have to be mirror images of each other. Obviously, if you're going to buy an Audi and you're not selling enough goods, somebody's going to have to lend you money to buy the Audi, and that's the blue line. Okay, there is some. The green line, which is investment, is some money flowing in from particularly the northern European countries to finance the blue line. That's normal, and it's probably the only instance in which an iron law of economics is actually fulfilled, which is the money flows from the rich to the poor. This should happen always, but it somehow doesn't seem to happen most of the times. The red line shouldn't be there, okay? That's just an adjustment. It's the target to the Euro system, the intra-Euro system balances. Essentially what it means is that when I go to buy Audi, I don't get, in Spain, I don't get a loan from a Spanish bank. Well, a Spanish bank is going to give me a loan, but they don't manage to borrow this from Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is not lending to Spanish banks anymore. The Spanish bank goes to the Spanish central bank, and the Spanish central bank gives it the loan in exchange of collateral. This is not just for loans, which is why I'm titling it Fear itself. This Eurosystem red line is not just covering for the blue line, which in fact is adjusting. If you notice, the current account is adjusting. It's covering for the green line. What do we mean? What's going on? what's happening is that we have a run on all assets in Spain. Essentially, people are pulling out of Spain on all asset classes, and the only thing that's stopping this from basically collapsing is the European Central Bank doing its job. Okay, the European Central Bank is doing what it should be doing, which is extend unlimited liquidity in a situation of panic, and that's all fine. The only problem is the slope of these lines. Okay, they don't seem to like moderate or something. They seem to, I mean, they seem on a trend that is not conducive to any good outcome. Okay, 400 billion euros is 40% of the Spanish GDP. Okay, so 40% of the Spanish GDP in the last 4 quarters was financed by ECB, or the equivalent of 40% of was the Eurosystem financing. You can do it. This is for Asher Commodity from the IMF. You can do it for Germany, Finland, and Netherlands on the one side. You see that the way that they are lending is not through yellow, which is capital flows, but through blue, which is these target claims. And on the right, you can do it in Greece, Ireland, Italy, Spain, Portugal on aggregate. And again, the blue is what, quote, shouldn't be there. That's the financing that comes from the intra-Euro system and is not coming from capital flows into the country. I want to argue that this is not a macro crisis, contrary to what it might seem. It's essentially a crisis of governance, okay? And it's a crisis of governance in 2 levels. It's a crisis of governance in the European Union, where we have an incomplete monetary union, and it was known. Okay, if you go back to the Deadlock report and you read it, there are paragraphs explaining these kind of problems. Okay, the thing is, there is a method to this madness. Okay, the European Union has always had this bike metaphor that it only exists as long as we are pedaling forward, and if we start pedaling, we fall. Okay, and how do we pedal? Well, the bike, as you know, is kind of an unstable thing, right? I mean, we pedal because we're falling. Okay, we're falling forward in a way, and this is the idea. You kind of create incomplete construction, and then you fall into the next step. Of course, this has worked every time before, and the question now is whether we went too far in leaving a hole and an unsolved problem. But you shouldn't forget, and I think every single time I read Anglo-Saxon comments from England or from the US, from out of the Euro area, this problem is way understated. Though not every time, but very often, which is the point here is a political point. Remember how this started. It started because Germany was unifying and needed a counterpoint, and France needed to tie Germany together. What that means is that we shouldn't ever underestimate what the European leaders will do at the end of the day to keep this thing moving. What we don't want, I think everyone in Europe doesn't want, is the Rhine to be again, you know, to have the Romans and the barbarians on the 2 sides. Or you can put your favorite war from the last 2,000 years in the north or in the south, okay? I'd love to be able to call them the barbarians again. It would make me feel better, but it won't be possible. The other problem of governance is the peripheral countries. I think this crisis is very much like the Indonesian crisis. I mean, you have a big wall of money, the capital, huge inflow of capital going into these countries, with governance problems. And governance problems wouldn't be a problem if you have, like, you know, you're little, you have, like, for example, one of the banks I'll talk about later, the cajas. If you're small, you cannot borrow, you're not going to get yourself in big trouble. But if you are big and you are, you know, you can access the world of resources and you're crazy and badly governed, then you're going to blow up the world, okay? So there are 3 Euro design problems that I want to discuss and that I think are at the root of this. First is, what was the incompleteness? What was the governance incompleteness? First, you put in the monetary policy without doing anything about fiscal and banking supervision. What it means is that you're giving people the certainty that they can avoid exchange risk and kind of move money from one country to another. There's a 1998 article from Paul de Grauwe that in the Financial Times that it's a beauty that I recommend you to read. He has in his website. And he basically compares the Asian crisis to what could happen in Europe. And he talks, suppose some European country, this is 1998, like for example Spain, were to have an asset bubble. And he explains how it would be exactly like the Asian crisis. It would be, but multiplied by a lot, because you have all these capital inflows by people who feel kind of confident about the lack of exchange rate risk, and you create this credit bubble. The second is the currency, the rollover risk. The US is borrowing in dollars. There is, I mean, even though some party politics might play a role and there might be somebody playing games, at the end of the day, there's no real rollover risk. You think that the US debt will be paid because at the end of the day, you cannot borrow little pieces of paper that you print yourselves. So that's never going to be, you're never going to run out of those little pieces of paper. Spain and the countries in the European Union are borrowing in real resources that they have to repay. So the markets might worry, are you actually going to have enough resources? Third incompleteness is, of course, exchange rate adjustment. If you go through a bubble and you get these prices to increase too much, then you have to go down. We're going to have this infinite kind of long process. I mean, you can see lots of graphs on convergence and unit labor costs getting back in line. They're just not getting back in line, okay? At the speed we're getting back in line and these overvaluations being corrected will take 1,000 years to get there. I mean, it's really not happening. So what you have is, within this union, suddenly there is a risk, and then boom, flight to safety, everybody goes to the north, because that's the safe asset is not a common safe asset that the union shares. It's like the safe asset will be bonds from the New York state. And suddenly people from Mississippi start thinking, my goodness, Mississippi is going to default, the safe asset is New York. Then you suddenly get this exaggeration of the crisis and these problems. And of course, the diabolic loop, which now the politicians recognize as crucial, which essentially means as the banks are getting insolvent, they're dragging down their sovereigns who are backing them up, whereas the sovereigns are getting in trouble. The banks who have lots of banking debt in their balance sheets are being dragged down. So I'll tell you about the diabolic loop and how to solve it. But before I start, just this was a brief introduction, just to show you this parallel with the Indonesian crisis. Let me show you this phrase from Paul Krugman in 1998. He says, the problem began with financial intermediaries, institutions whose liabilities were perceived to have a government guarantee but were essentially unregulated and therefore subject to severe moral hazard problems. Here, we have to extend the idea of financial intermediaries from the Spanish cajas to the Greek government, but essentially this is very similar kind of attraction of the capital flow and sudden stop. Okay, so what I'm doing is explain briefly the Spanish case and then tell you how the INET proposal deals with this. So I'm going to argue that Spain had a variant of the Dutch disease. Okay, we had bricks, they had gas, but it's essentially the same problem, and I'm going to show you how it matters. So Spain went through a very good period of convergence from 96 to 2009. This is from a study we did with McKinsey, and the convergence came together with persistent inflation divergence. Spain had a much higher inflation rate than Germany. What that meant is that the monetary policy wasn't adequate. Spain had, if you look at those moments, the zero line it gets up to -2, so the zero is the second line. You see that Spain had, in these moments of enormous growth, it had a grossly inadequate monetary policy with negative interest rates for some of the period. So we have all this cheap financing. So what do we do with it? So on the demand side, Spaniards are kind of used to defaults. Spain came very high on the rankings of Rogov and Reinhardt. I won't tell you exactly how high. Very high on those rankings. And on the supply side, there was a large pool of unskilled employers, and there was an institutional setup with temp contracts that helped this lower skill segment. And then you have the financing channel. And the financing channel has these peculiarities, which is the cajas. Essentially, the political economy here is as follows. Spanish democracy starts from above, okay? There was no revolution. General Franco died in bed, okay, to the eternal shame of Spaniards, okay? He was happily a dictator until the very last day, okay? And there were no kind of decentralized powers in all the provinces and all the little town halls that organically created these parties. The parties were created from above, and the political system was created from above. Then the political system decentralized to accommodate the Catalan and Basque realities, with, as you have seen, very little success, and created all these structures below, but essentially these structures come from above. And all of these are, I mean, more or less patronage appointments from above, which means that you have a very powerful political system that is kind of, essentially at some point, the civil society has been kind of withdrawing in the face of this. And you have, in particular, the cajas. The cajas were, in many cases, not in all, not like Caixa in Catalonia, for example, but in many cases, the cajas were this, like the Landesbanken in Germany. And I don't quite know if the savings and loans in the US were as politicized, but they were basically boards formed by politicians who use them as development banks. And that's fine when you're a little caja in a province and you can have a little bit of money to build an arts complex or something. But when you are a very large caja with hundreds of billions in assets, like the one which just went under this May, Bankia, and you are able to reach the outside capital markets, and you are able to create from scratch developments with 6,000 or houses, or with new runways, or etc. Then these governance problems really matter. And these cajas basically were growing very much as they were getting this financing. This is the market share increasing all through the period, but from much before. And the way they grew was by finding a real estate developer who couldn't have access. So how does a caja from Catalonia or a caja from my city, Valladolid, go to Granada and get clients if everybody has a bank account? Well, it goes to a developer, offers him a loan that nobody else would, a better loan. The development starts, and then he gets subrogated on the loan, and that way they have lots of clients. So it's real estate. I did some work on how much the banking experience and the capital, the human capital, matter for these real estate loans. And what we showed is that the cajas that had worse human capital were more complicit in this lending. 42% on the very top, you see percents of GDP. 42% of Spanish GDP, 420 billion euros, was loans to construction and real estate. Spain was building lots of houses during the period. It's like Phoenix and like Miami. It's not a housing bubble in New York where you can't build. It's a housing bubble in a place where the supply curve is essentially horizontal and the prices have to return to the steady state. So you're building so much, you can, I mean, if you've ever been to Spain, it's a country is essentially, the center of the country is essentially empty. You can build as much as you want. There's no constraint. It's only political constraint. So as long as you're adding, those prices eventually have to collapse. And so Spain built up all these private debts. So my argument here is that you have the wall of money from Europe coming in, mediated by with these low interest rates, with the safety of the euro floor, mediated by this not very efficient or very politicized financial system. And this is the left-hand side of the equation. This is the result, not the cause. The fact that you had a current account deficit is the consequence of this cheap financing coming in, these prices going up, and people going out and being able to buy themselves kind of quote excessive amounts of goods, if you want, and investment, of course, in all this housing. So this has left Spain with three long-term problems, which I think are serious. First, the bricklaying and sun-related investments are not conducive to human capital investments, and I want to show you that. This is one of the most surprising. I'm going to show you. If you look at the left, these are males. These are the college premium. So how much does a college person earn more than a high schooler? And the normal way this should look is like up to here. It should be growing. Okay, that's like what has happened in the US. That has happened everywhere because of technology and trade. Inequality is increasing. We know it. We understand it, and we regret how much it has gone up. But that's the returns to education, and that's going to drive people into schooling. It has a good thing. What has happened in Spain, especially for males, not quite so for women, is that the college premium has been decreasing. And that happened since 2000. Why? Because, well, you could stop studies and go into construction and start laying bricks. This is very unusual. As you see this negative number, neither Germany, of course not the US, have had those negative numbers. And it has to do with the increase in the share of workers who are from 12% to over 20% who are laying bricks, the construction share, and the increase in the wages, which go from 25th percentile to the 40th percentile. You could earn 40th percentile wages in the wage distribution if you were in construction. So what's the first consequence then? High school dropout rates are too high. Okay. Here you have the average dropout rate, which is, as you see, one of the highest in the OECD. And here you have the trends. And this is part of the message about Spain. What happened in these 10 years is Spain not only wasted 10 years of development, but actually went back in some sense. What happened here is all of these countries have decreasing dropout rates. Spain was here. It was dropping. Clearly, you can imagine the trend just by seeing the blue line. And what happens is the boom in real estate starts growing. And this thing not only stops going down, but it starts increasing. Okay. So the first thing we have is not only very large unemployment, which I haven't shown you because you know it, but the large youth unemployment and a large proportion of people who have just abandoned rationally. I mean, at 17 years old, you quit school because there's no point, abandon the labor force, and now need to be recycled. The second thing that has happened is the collapse in revenue. So contrary to what many people kind of will argue, the crisis was not the result of irresponsibility on the part of the state. Even the IMF structural budget estimates didn't say Spain was in a structural budget deficit at the time. In fact, on a just plain revenue versus expenditure without any structural calculation, I think just adjust the raw numbers, you see that Spain had big surplus. And what happens is you start the crisis here, and what you have is very simple. Unemployment benefits cost 40 billion this year. That's 4% of GDP. Okay, this is 4 points. That's it. I mean, you're there basically. And of course, the revenue related to real estate was the main source of financing of the town halls and of the regions, and now it's disappeared. Of course, the problem is that how are we going to fix this in a situation where the political economy is so tricky? And the political economy is tricky for the same reason it's always in the Western world right now, which is that we don't have anymore a demographic pyramid. We already have these cohorts which are getting bigger and which are going to get even bigger. The dependency ratio, the share of people on working age per person retired is going from 4.5% to 1 in the next 40 years. So you have a situation where the ones who have the power are the pensioners, and the government presented the budget yesterday where it said it's going to revalue the pensions for this year and increase them by 1% next year. So basically the pensions, even though everything else is in austerity, the pensions continue pulling. The second thing that makes the budget situation hard to reverse is the regional issue. A big share of the cost in Spain is paid by the regions. So 36% of the expenditure, a big share of the expenditure is actually undertaken by the regions, 36% of the expenditure, and this is related to health and employment and things like that. What that means is that it's very hard, politically extremely costly to cut. Catalonia started cutting earlier than most, and you can imagine how the Catalan government was doing with the polls and with the public opinion when they were closing emergency room, closing hospitals and things like that. Of course, they managed to reverse that with the path towards independence by giving people this idea they can escape reality, which is always very attractive to in a situation like this. So we have institutions that were damaged by the bubble. You have all this money, and you have all this kind of patronage. This kind of in a situation with no budget constraint is too easy. And I think that the government is reformist, is trying to do changes, but it's not quite clear to me that the government is really committed to transparency and governance reforms. It's committing to the macro reforms, but it's not clear that it's committed to kind of withdrawing the political parties from the public scene and kind of from the public domain, leaving civil society more there and trying to get the rules of the game being more clearly accepted. The appointment of the SEC commissioner, Popular Party politician last week, is a notable case. The Spanish SEC, the CNMV. The third long-term consequence that you can imagine is the housing stock, a very large housing inventory. That's the US housing inventory, around 10 months of inventory or 12 months. That's the huge Spanish housing inventory, around 100 months, okay, of supply. So we're talking about different things. Of course, this is not Phoenix, Arizona, okay? If I was, maybe I should be comparing the Arizona housing inventory or the Florida housing inventory with Spain, and I would get a much more reasonable comparison. So the commercial real estate loans are still sitting in the books of the banks. Let me just quickly say what the policy response in Spain has been in the financial system, competitiveness in fiscal crisis. So in the financial system, it's been slow. Today is the very big day of the financial system. The numbers for the bad banks will be released, for the bank losses will be released today, and it's kind of the start of really the recognition of the situation. But the situation seems to be that Spain is going to absorb a large part of the losses that were incurred, like Ireland did. And I am kind of surprised and a bit shocked by the European Union leaders going back in their promises this week. They had said they would help Spain recapitalize these banks, as I will tell you in a minute. The second axis is dealing with competitiveness laws. There was a labor reform. There's some liberalizations, and I think there will be more, trying to get all these competitiveness issues back. The key issue here is the returning of this lost generation, all these youth people who are going to not get pensions, are paying like crazy for the pension of their grandparents, don't have jobs, are on temporary contracts, have lost the training. I mean, you have a generation that is really getting very squeezed, and I don't think they see the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think there's at the moment much light for them, and this is the problem I think that the government is still to address. The third axis is the fiscal sustainability. I mean, Paul Krugman again today says it's crazy that Spain keeps cutting, and he's right, it's crazy, but Spain doesn't have a choice. I mean, if you want to borrow and you're the US, you can always borrow from the Fed. But if you're Spain, you want to go an expansionary policy, who's going to give you the money to do that? Okay, so that's just like, there's no debate. I mean, we would all wish that austerity was relaxed, but it's not being done. And as I told you, Catalonia is choosing this fuite en avant. How do you say that in English, Nicola? This escape forward route. And I have little useful to tell you except that, you know, imagine communities and all that. We economists don't understand this kind of psychological kind of people kind of going forward into the, but actually you cannot live without hope. And if they tell you like, oh, the fault of all these problems are the rest of Spain, and we have a solution for you, which is just get rid of the rest of Spain, everyone goes, ooh, great, and everything is solved, right? So I don't think that's a really constructive. It's a negative sum game. The pie is going to be smaller, and I don't think negative sum games are really kind of very good at this point. But there is hope in Spain. The export performance is fantastic. The exports as a share of GDP are increasingly imbalanced. Services are very much in the blue. As you see, the balance on the left is very positive. So Spain has been exporting a lot. Spain hasn't lost market share in a moment when the UK and the US has lost gigantic market share of world exports to China. Spain hasn't lost any single 0.01% of market share. So there is a very dynamic competitive segment that is pushing forward, and that is the hope of the country. But as I was telling you, okay, there's some adjustment in the current account, the bank's loss recognition is happening, the things are 3 responses to the crisis that are progressing, and yet the panic is there, and the recession is getting worse. Problem loans are spreading from the real estate sector to all the other sectors. And I think my point until now is to say the crisis Spain had was not a crisis of a government that was irresponsible or citizens that were irresponsible. It was a crisis of banks having too much money, too easy money coming from abroad, and the lenders as well as the borrowers have a responsibility in that kind of crisis. Of course, as in all of these problems, and as Keynes one observed, the one originally observed, these asymmetries are kind of it's hard for the debtors to force the creditors to take this balanced position. So the INET proposal. So now we go back and we say, okay, so what does this have to do with Spain? So why is Spain in so much trouble? First of all, it has no exchange rate control. If Spain was Indonesia, the first thing the IMF would say is like devaluation. Okay, this is the largest adjustment the IMF would have overseen if Spain was being overseen by IMF in the last 30 years for sure, and it's done without any devaluation. Okay, first thing that makes this situation tricky. Second, we have this fiscal contagion that if you were in a monetary union like the US, you know, if Florida is in big trouble, has lots of unemployment, the checks come from Connecticut. The Connecticut don't revolt saying that they want independence from the US. They do also transfer 8% of GDP like Catalonia does, but nobody has heard Connecticut independence movement. You don't have, maybe we should start it. You don't have these fiscal stabilizers coming from Germany either you don't have these fiscal stabilizers coming from Germany to pay unemployment insurance in Spain. So if Spain, all of it has higher unemployment, if it was Florida, you know, the unemployment insurance, those 4% of GDP points wouldn't show up in the Spanish budget. It would show up in the union budget. They wouldn't make Spanish deficit explode. And third, the banking backstop. The third problem Spain has is the banks are in trouble. They have all these problem loans. If the Florida banks have troubles, the FDIC from the US will take care of them. That's not a big deal. But if Spanish banks have trouble and the Spanish state has to be behind, and the Spanish state has all these big unemployment checks that it has to pay, then it certainly is going to be in big trouble. So the INET proposal takes these 3 problems into account and says, what do you need to do now here? To stop this huge escape of capitals north, this enormous panic, you need to restore faith in the euro area. People need to feel the euro is here to stay. Second, you have to reverse these unemployment increases. I mean, the situation in Spain has dramatically changed in the last year. Until last year, people could see a hope, maybe because they thought, well, maybe with a new government. When you went there, you always felt like things were kind of, okay, not as bad as they seem from the outside. Right now, the situation is starting to turn really tricky. And you need to reverse the unemployment increase, and you're not going to have to need households, families, and corporations to borrow at close to 0 rates. They cannot be borrowed at 9, 10, 11%. Okay, that's not gonna do it. You need to reduce the debt overhang, and you need to address the structural flaws. The key inside of the proposal, the thing that we've tried to push here, is the simple intellectual step to say there's a legacy problem and there is an institutional building problem. And these 2 problems are separate, and they both have to be solved. the things that you do to solve the legacy problem don't have to condition your long-run solution. But you need to solve it, okay? And all countries on the legacy problem, and here's the second step. Contrary to what the three leaders of the three countries, creditor countries said this week, the legacy problem is the one that needs to be mutualized. We need to say, we all made a mistake, the euro was badly designed, creditors and debtors have a joint responsibility, we need to solve it together. And that's going to have to mean that the creditors are going to take some responsibility for those liabilities. On the future, however, the euro original vision, which is a minimal political union, you cannot have a single Europe. That's a crazy idea. It's not going to happen politically. One democracy with one leader on top. But you can have a minimal political union, just a financial union, just enough to support the banking union, with potentially some other transfer scheme. If I was writing this document on my own instead of 17 people, I would say some European unemployment scheme at the European-wide level. We don't think the Eurobonds are a necessary part. The Eurobonds as a joint liability thing. You need to mutualize debt backwards, yes, like the Council of Wise Men from Germany said, but you don't need to mutualize debt forward, okay? So you don't need to tell the Germans, I mean, the key point here is to convince the Germans you will not be sending checks to Greece and for Spain to the rest of their lives. There's going to be instruments that is going to avoid that, and I'm going to try to convince you that that's possible. So, first of all, on the short-run emergency measures, solving the legacy problem is fair and is necessary. You need to eliminate the debt overhang, and you can keep good incentives as long as the banks pay for the bank losses first, and as long as you continue with adjustment plans. So we would have partial mutualization to recapitalize the banks, to finance jointly the excessive debt acquired, so not all the debt, but just the excessive debt, to put together a growth plan, and it would be with a commitment that it's limited in time and limited in cost. Okay, here the deal is you got to reassure the Germans and the Dutch that they're not starting a transfer union. And I agree, they can say like, look, that's what you tell me today, but like all debtors, every day you say it's just only for today that you want money, and tomorrow you tell me the same thing again. That's the problem, okay? So bear with me, and let's see if we can pull it. A partial mutualization is going to preserve incentives as long as it's not all, as long as the banks are first, and we suggest that you only guarantee new debt issuance up to an agreed level. So only the excessive debt beyond 60% of the GDP would be guaranteed, and it would be guaranteed as new emissions come in the primary market, so that you always have this stick to say, well, if you stop behaving, we're not going to continue guaranteeing the debt. Other short-run measures, we believe that the ECB had to eliminate this convertibility premium. We were very pleased that 2 months after our document was, or 1 month after the document was put together, Draghi started talking about this, and then September 7th decision announced it. It's very good measure. It's very hard to implement. We can talk in the discussion in a second. I literally don't have the time. I apologize for running now. Fiscal adjustment, and then potentially some voluntary debt restructuring for the countries that cannot make it. Now, a key issue from our document, and if you realize that we have 3 top German economists, you realize how hard it is to agree on this, and it was agreed, was that there would have to be emergency monetary measures that would have to be accommodative. We actually didn't say targeting a nominal GDP level. We didn't say targeting a higher inflation, having a higher inflation for the Eurozone as a whole, but we almost say it, like we are just one word away from saying it. So it does say like the ECB should kind of balance and go towards a more expansive monetary policy, more accommodative during the emergency. Okay, so how do we put a long-run solution that doesn't facilitate large bubbles, doesn't create these sudden stops, and doesn't make for these current account imbalances that we were just discussing as a consequence? So we have the following elements. The crucial element, the inevitable element of a monetary union is a banking union. Otherwise, you're going to always have the Florida Bank or the Arkansas Bank destabilizing the Arkansas state, and people worrying in Arkansas, and the banks and the state are going to ever manage to get it out of there. Okay, you need the US Fed and the FDIC to be behind. The second is some joint borrowing tool to avoid the flows from the center to the periphery of the money, from the periphery to the center. In a moment of panic, the people from Arkansas take all the money and take it to New York, as the people from Italy and from Spain are currently doing, or at least the investors in Italy and Spain. Third, financial reform. I mean, we are, I think, collectively shocked at how little has changed for the too big to fail banks, and how much they seem to be dictating the agenda today as ever. Fourth, sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. And fifth, the fiscal compact, the fiscal rules, which have already been agreed and which I think are appropriately strong. Just a couple of points on the banking union. You need three things: a common supervision, a resolution mechanism, and a deposit guarantee. The deposit guarantee, everybody agrees, is going to be pushed far, far, far into the future. The resolution has to be common, but for common resolution, you have to have already a common supervision. You need some backstop for the resolution and the supervision, and that we think, at least initially, has to come from the ESM, has to come when the country, Arkansas, let's say, in my analogy all the time, Arkansas takes the first 20% of the losses, and the ESM, the European Union as a whole, takes the rest. We think this is feasible, it's not expensive, it's not enormous, and eventually, anyway, it's going to be funded by the banks themselves. You only need this right now for the banking crisis in the next 20 years. Remember, the past banking crisis, it's resolved through this past demutualization. Okay, so we're just talking about the long-run institutions here. The Eurobonds proposal, we took into account the SB's proposal, which was from the Euronomics group, Marcus Brunnermeier, Philip Lane, another group of economists, in which I'm also, with whom I'm also working, Thanos Santos, Dimitri Vallanos, Marco Pagano. And the idea here is, it's a securitization idea. So you're going to say, well, the whole crisis started with CDOs, you're going to propose a CDO out of the crisis. We believe the innovation is actually a good innovation. And the idea is this agency issues a debt. There's no lack of transparency like with mortgages here. You buy debt from the countries in a fixed proportion to the GDP, you package them together and you sell this instrument, which is the European safe bond, with a joint liability. It has a junior and a senior tranche, so when Spain defaults, for example, or whomever it is, or Greece, or whomever defaults, then it gets absorbed by the junior tranche. This junior tranche would yield around 10%, the senior tranche would yield around 2%. We think it's doable. We think in a steady state, the markets will take this junior tranche, and it does two crucial things. It eliminates that's the European Debt Agency balance sheet. It eliminates the diabolic loop because the banks don't have in their vaults paper from their own countries, but they have papers from the European Union, from these. So you eliminate the Basel zero weights for the debt that the banks have from their own countries, and it redirects the flight to safety, because now it's not a flight to safety between the south and the north, but it's a flight to safety within this SB, within the European safe bond. And also we think it would stabilize the market in the short run, and it allows you to kind of build towards more Eurobonds if you eventually want, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen. I'm sorry, I'm already 1 minute over my allotted time. That's why, I'm happy to explain any of this in the discussion. Just 2 slides on current development. I said you never underestimate how much Europe is committed to this. Europe wants to do it, but we are democracies, okay? And that's not a problem, that's a virtue, right? But democracies have the constraint that you have to do stuff that the voters like. And voters feel, you talk to a smart Dutch voter or to a smart German voter. I was talking to a professor from the Netherlands the other day who was like, Professor of Public Admin, a really smart person, everything. She's like, I don't understand any of this. It doesn't make any sense. It'll happen behind closed doors. It's like crazy, okay? This is like someone who reads all the newspapers and everything. Everybody has this feeling of lack of control. And so what happens is you have this tension between we all want the euro and we all want Europe to be built, and at the same time, every time you do a big step, you get these steps back. So this week, there was this real shocking reversal to me of the promise that was made in the 29th summit. The 29th of June summit was very positive. Look at this first phrase, which seems that it was written by some of us academics. We affirm that it's imperative to break the vicious circle between banks and sovereigns. This is from the summit agreement. And we think that the ESM is going to take over this banking sector recapitalization for the ESF. And now, and today is Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I woke up at 2:30 US time, so I could read all the newspapers. Reuters is saying that absolutely no supervision, no sharing of legacy assets, which is exactly the opposite of what we say. All the legacy is what has to be shared to get these countries to grow again and to recognize this was a common mistake. And the declaration by the 3 creditor countries, Netherlands, Germany, and Finland, saying that they don't want any sharing. And the single supervisory mechanism, the European Union agreed on a banking union along the lines that we're suggesting, but France and Germany are just kind of stuck bickering about this single supervisory mechanism, and really it should be put together on the 1st of January 2013, in order for the ESM to start taking the legacy assets from Spain and from Ireland, and that doesn't seem at all to be in the cards. So huge step forward in June, a huge step forward from Draghi. So two of the things that we were asking for seem to be there. The European Central Bank is going to become a real bank backing the European countries' debt, is going to participate in when countries are in a situation that is kind of, they are doing their part, let's say. And huge step in terms of banking union and a roadmap on the fiscal union. This would be essential for Spain because it would solve all these legacy problems that I showed you. It will allow for the start of this coming out of this big hole. But then big backtracking every time that you think the thing is starting to look a little bit better. This week, Jens Weidmann, the German parliament, and the three creditors kind of pouring a lot of cold water over all of this. So I think the INET suggestions, it's a feasible incentive compatible combination of short run, we have a legacy problem, and long run, we have a design problem, measures to stop the crisis. We think that it could make a massive difference to stop problems like the ones that is killing Spain. As I showed you, the bottom line is Spain is doing the current account adjustment. I showed you the numbers with the current account, with the goods balance, and with the service balances, they're all getting to zero. Spain is going to be in current account balance by just basically killing private consumption. But that's the way these things sometimes happen. So Spain is doing its part, but the panic continues. And the panic continues because of this flight to safety. You've got to stop the flight to safety. And the measures that we have outlined could contribute to recovering, giving hope to people, and recovering this idea that the European Union is going to stay together. I also think that you need to find a way to help some of these institutional problems that I have outlined super briefly on the southern European countries. I mean, Greece has a problem with a system that is built on patronage, as you know, post-dictatorship, Portugal post-dictatorship, patronage. Spain was also coming out of dictatorship, and the system wasn't so much on the public side, but on the semi-public caja side. Ireland has had also governance problems with their real estate developers. So, I mean, maybe the structural reforms that we need help with from the northern countries are not so much the structural reforms of here's how you run a better labor market, which we need to do. Spain needs to improve its labor market humongously, but the reforms that say here's how you run these independent institutions that are going to ensure that these problems are checked, solved on time. And I am aware that it's not the only country where variants of crony capitalism are around. We see this in the US, we see this in everywhere. But when it happens, when you see it, when it has binds, is when you have to really kind of deal with it. Thank you.